racism and classism requires that we dismantle the prison system. I just want to take a second to introduce myself really quickly, and then I'll turn it over to Jasmine. My name is Dr. Brashani Reese. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, specializing in forensics. I'm a trained restorative justice facilitator, a criminal justice reform activist, and a writer and public speaker. And Jasmine, would you care to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Jasmine Borges. I am a formerly incarcerated woman. I am an activist and organizer and ready to roll with you. Let's go.
Let's do this. Great. Awesome. So a little bit of framework for tonight. There is going to be a Q&A session, and we're hoping that it will be a robust Q&A session with plenty of time. And you're going to be able to ask questions during the chat window. You'll notice that you can't unmute yourself. We did that specifically just to get through the presentation. But at the end, we're also going to ask that you wait and hold your questions all the way to the end when we get to the Q&A. Some participants find it to be distracting when other people are typing in the chat windows. So let's dive right in. This webinar is meant to be an introduction to the issue of mass incarceration. So a little bit of a disclaimer. We're going to be touching on a lot of different topics tonight, and that means that we're going to be touching on them in a relatively surface level way. So we encourage people to take notes, write down things that interest you, write your questions down. I promise you we could do webinars within webinars of all of the information that you're going to see tonight. So without further ado, let's move right in, or attempt to. There we go. Okay, so our objective for this evening, simply to provide a preliminary introduction into this issue and articulate a general understanding of why ending systemic racism and classism requires us to dismantle the prison system. Our agenda, we're going to start with what we know, go over some statistics, some disparities that are well researched, and then we're going to turn it over for Jasmine to share a little bit of her story. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. Like I said, it's our hope that it will be a robust Q&A session. So as we all know, this conversation has started because of police brutality. But law enforcement is one extension of a much larger system. In many ways, the issues that we have witnessed with police brutality are actually symptomatic of a much deeper issue. The system of detainment and incarceration, also known as the prison system. Physical, psychological, and emotional brutality begin with the arrest, but it moves on from there. Other extensions of the prison system include the court system, the prison officials and administrators and correctional officers whose livelihood depends on prisons staying intact, the corporations, vendors, and contractors who make millions of dollars off of prisons every year, the parole release system, which we'll just mention really quickly, varies dramatically from state to state, and many people don't even have any insight into what it actually takes to get released from prison, and the parole release system is how many people come home. And then reentry system, which is how incarcerated people are, they're the services that are supposed to be provided for people who are incarcerated to be able to come home as returning citizens. Last, but by no means least, the politicians are an extension of the system as well. And it's our hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll have a clearer understanding of how our political system and our politicians in particular play significant roles in these systems. Some might even say that they're the crux of the situation, in that they are both potentially the problem and the solution all wrapped into one. So there is a lot that we know, and we're going to start with some statistics. But first, I just want to take a moment to express Jasmine and I's gratitude for the many, many, many people who have come before us. The people who are formerly incarcerated, the activists, the researchers, the scholars, I mean, the organizations, it could go on and on and on. But the reason that Jasmine and I are here today having this conversation with you is because we are standing on the shoulders of giants. And we just want to say thank you. Those people have been trying to bring mass incarceration to the public forefront as an issue for decades. So the United States is ranked #1 in the world in incarceration. There are 2.2 million people in our nation's jails and prisons. And for those of you who might not know, there is a distinction between jail and prison. The shorthand version of it is that jail is where people are awaiting trial or are serving shorter sentences, usually for lesser offenses, less serious offenses. And then prison is everybody else. So you've been sentenced, you're serving a longer period, and it's usually a more significant charge. So the US incarcerates people at the rate of 655 people per 100,000. And as you can see, our closest competitors for this title of #1 are El Salvador, Rwanda, and Russia. These are not countries that we consider to be champions of democracy or human rights. This next slide shows pretty much the same information, but I wanted to point out what many people refer to as similar countries to the United States. So you'll see this chart compares us to our European colleagues. It's also noteworthy because the United States, our court system is built on the United Kingdom system, right? England is where our founding forefathers came from. So you can see how far we diverge in terms of our incarceration rates. So how did we get here? Some history. Let's go all the way back to the 1950s. So from 1955 to 1965, sweeping legislation was passed that was designed to close long-term psychiatric mental health institutions. And many people saw this as a very good initiative, a very positive thing. Some of those institutions had reached the size of small cities. And there were reports of human rights violations, abuses of power, so many problems, so much abuse. The problem is that legislation deinstitutionalized the hospitals, but then the follow-up legislation was not passed to fund community resources, outpatient services, or housing for the people who were already identified as suffering from major mental illness. Then late in the 1960s, all the way through the 1970s, crime and violence began to rise all over the country. It's important to note because prior to this, local crime and punishment was handled on a relatively local issue. It was a local issue. So this is the first time that we start to see criminal justice as a wedge political issue. And by that, I mean it started to show up in people's political campaigns on the national stage. And that was a relatively new thing. In 1971, Nixon declared the war on drugs. I would be remiss in my purpose here tonight if I did not mention that over these 2 decades, the backdrop for this was the Vietnam War in 1955 to 1975 and the Civil Rights Act. Pardon me just a second. Sorry, checking the chat, make sure everything is good. Okay. So if it's hard to think about, well, what's the connection between the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Act and people's attitudes around crime and drugs, I would offer the example of how our modern day politics, our political system is highly politicized. So everything from our environmental issues to the response to COVID-19 became a political issue. And in the 60s, politics were also highly polarized. There were many people who theorized that President Nixon could not arrest hippies and people who were protesting against the Vietnam War. He could not arrest them for protesting. And he also couldn't arrest Black people for being a part of the civil rights movement. But with the war on drugs, suddenly we could actually arrest and detain many of those individuals. Moving to the 1980s, since Nixon was the founder of the war on drugs, Ronald Reagan turbocharged it. We could do an entire webinar on the war on drugs in the 80s underneath President Reagan, but I'll offer this one salient example to highlight what we're talking about tonight. In the 1980s, the difference between crack cocaine and powdered cocaine was vast. Crack cocaine became more illegal than powdered cocaine. It carried a harsher sentence for charges of possession or trafficking, and you were also more likely to be to be found guilty if you were charged with crack cocaine possession as opposed to powdered cocaine. we look at those two drugs sociologically, generally speaking, powdered cocaine is way more expensive and is often thought of as a suburban, wealthy, generally white person's drug of choice, whereas in crack cocaine was much cheaper, and therefore it was used more in poorer neighborhoods, especially urban neighborhoods, and those have a high representation of people of color. Then we go into the 1990s. There was a crisis of youth violence in our country in the early 1990s, especially in our cities. And I don't know if any of you remember, but actually Boston was one of those places where we had this crisis. There were a number of adolescents that were committing violent crimes, and it reached peak levels. So criminologists at that time, they actually sparked a nationwide panic when they came out with something called the super predator theory. So this theory predicted that there would be an explosion of adolescent super predators, that not only were they violent kids, but they were malevolent, they were callous, they were unemotional, and they were going to prey upon our communities and wreak havoc, essentially. This theory never came to fruition. And it's been debunked for approximately 2 decades. And even those criminologists have walked back those theories. But research suggests that to this day, the American public's perception is that young urban youth are more dangerous than adults. So sweeping legislation during these 3 decades or so, right? In response to a crisis of homelessness and mental illness, we have more incarcerated mentally ill people. In response to a crisis of drugs and addiction, we have more addicts who are incarcerated. And in response to a crisis of youth violence, we have more male youth incarcerated. When we look at these 3 categories of people, the things that they have in common are that they are poorer communities and they are disproportionately people of color. Again, I can do a whole webinar just on these pieces of legislation, but very quickly, these 3 key pieces of legislation have come up time and time again as being problematic in our system. So mandatory minimum sentences were implemented for certain crimes. This essentially translates to that judges lost all power in terms of their sentencing. So let's say that they felt that somebody actually didn't need to go to prison, that there was an alternative for them. If the crime that they were charged with had a mandatory minimum, that person had to go to prison regardless. Then there was increased overall length of sentencing. And what that phenomenon refers to is you have a ceiling and you have a floor of your sentencing. The ceiling is represented by our most extreme forms of punishment. So in the United States, you can receive the death penalty. Capital punishment exists in some states. We also use life without parole in every state in the nation. Then you have your floor. So your lesser charges, they actually rise up to the ceiling to sort of level out the process a little bit. And so when you have overall sentencing lengths that are this high, everything else gets higher. And then lastly, there's the automatic transfer of adolescents to adult court. And that happened in the 90s, again, in response to the youth violence that was happening. Even here in the state of Massachusetts, if you were a juvenile and you were charged with first-degree murder, there was no choice. You were automatically transferred from a juvenile court to an adult court, which also meant that if you were found guilty and you were sentenced to an adult sentence. This has resulted over these 4 decades of a 500% increase in incarceration. For those of you who are visual like me, that's what this looks like, which for me, the visual just really makes it very profoundly clear. So this is all in spite of the fact that the rates of crime, including violent crime, have steadily been declining since the early 1990s. So what we had essentially was the 60s, 70s, 80s, peak, starting in the 90s. Legislation gets passed as all of that is going up. But when everything started coming down again, legislation was not looked at. It wasn't repealed. It was just generally left in place. Research has confirmed that incarceration is not the reason that violence has gone down. And again, that's an entire webinar like on its own. Some more statistics for you, because we have reached a historic moment here in the United States. As of December 2019, this study came out, and it showed that almost 50% of adults in America have an immediate family member who is formerly or currently incarcerated. 1 in 4 have had a sibling incarcerated, 1 in 5 have had a parent incarcerated, and 1 in 7 have had a spouse or a co-parent incarcerated. So think about this for just a moment, given our purpose here tonight. Are you part of that 50%? Do you know someone who is part of that 50%? Because that's a big, big, big number. But if you don't go to work or go to school or just generally overhear people talking in your community about their loved ones who are inside, then that again reaffirms that the 50% of Americans who have this experience are a very specific 50% of Americans. It's not equal. Which brings me to what is in some ways the heart of our presentation tonight. All of these legislations, all of these social policies, they largely and disproportionately impacted and targeted poor communities, which by default are disproportionately communities of color. And make no mistake, Black men took the brunt of most of this. Let's just go through the numbers really quick. Lifetime likelihood of imprisonment, if you are white, for all men is 1 in 9. A white man, 1 in 17. A Black man, 1 in 3. A Latino man, 1 in 6. For all women, it's 1 in 56. But for white women, it's 1 in 111. Black women, 1 in 18. And Latino women, 1 in 45. So why do we say that the system is racist? And many people on the streets will sort of detract the issue by trying to say that individuals are not racist, I'm not a racist, you know, my family is not racist, and we understand that. But why we're here is because we're talking that the system is racist. So if legislators and lawmakers got together and they designed legislation, and then scholars and academic institutions and policymakers cried out and said, that piece of legislation is going to target and harm disproportionately all 5-year-olds in the country. If that happened, our legislatures would stop for a minute and they would say, well, that's terrible. They're 5. They're 5-year-olds. They're our kids. We don't want our 5-year-olds to be targeted. We care about them. But when they are told that the policies that they are designing or developing will disproportionately impact poor people and people of color, the response is then to blame the individuals in those communities. Well, they shouldn't have a gun. They shouldn't sell drugs. They should get a job. The list goes on and on. Okay. So I promised I would sort of talk a little bit about politicians. And as you can see from the slides here, politicians, social policy, right, go hand in hand because they are the people who ultimately vote and put those things in place. So our country is unique in yet another way in the world. It's unique in that our politicians design, propose, and implement social policies pretty much separate from our scientific, academic, research-based institutions. In America, there are actually very few examples, and again, I could do a webinar on this, in terms of experts and policymakers coming together, designing a policy that is going to be effective and also covers all of the costs needed, and having those bills pass as designed. And this is simply because our politicians are motivated by whether or not they will be reelected into office. And our researchers and our scholarly institutions are motivated by evidence-based research outcomes. So the reality that we have to face is that many of our lawmakers and our politicians know as much or as little as the average person about criminal justice and prevention rehabilitation, and things like that. So the politician is much more like the average person in this way, in that they know what feels good and they know what feels just, but they don't necessarily know what is effective. And they're pretty much influenced by what the perception of them is in their communities, because again, they want to be reelected. So let's use the issue of public safety as an example. The term public safety has become a shorthand phrase. It's a code. It's used by politicians and law enforcement who approach criminal justice with a tough on crime mindset. This is despite so much publication, so much scholarly research and knowledge over decades that mass incarceration is not effective for public safety. So the term public safety has become a catch-all phrase that justifies mass incarceration out of fear. And until recently, public safety was also the justified way in which police were protected when they acted in aggressive, or what we are now calling police brutality ways. So Mark Maurer and Ashley Nellis are two people that I highly admire. They're from the Sentencing Project. If you're not familiar with their work, amazing. The book is The Meaning of Life, The Case for Abolishing Life Sentences. And this quote about public safety, I think, really sums it all. I know it's a little lengthy, but it gives a really, this is again why campaign slogans for politicians are always short, right? Because actually you can capture it the best when it's in context. So achieving public safety is a complex undertaking that is not primarily premised on the threat or use of punishment. Parents understand this, and those in the middle and upper classes have the resources with which to establish strategies that are not reliant on punishment. They seek out good schools for their kids. They find health professionals to provide quality medical services and expose their children to a range of cultural, athletic, and educational opportunities. They don't describe these actions as crime control, but essentially that's one of the hoped for outcomes. By creating opportunities for their children, they reduce the prospects for well-off children to engage with the criminal justice system. Which brings me to my final points of the evening before I turn it over to my good friend and colleague Jasmine. In order to address the issue of mass incarceration, we must address our attitudes, beliefs, and feelings about violence and those who commit violence. In the last few years, many of you have probably heard that there has been a large movement to decarcerate drug offenses, people who are serving time purely on drug charges or for nonviolent offenses. I could do a webinar on that entire topic as well, but I will just leave it at the fact that Mark Maurer and Ashley Nellis, in the aforementioned book, they pointed out that if we released everyone today who was only serving time for purely drug offenses, no violent offenses, we would be releasing less than 20% of the population. Now, even though 20% is noteworthy, that's a really great place to start. That does not end mass incarceration. And when we look at the population as a whole, 55% are serving time for violent crimes. A couple things to note about that, right? Brain development. We have known for some time, at least for a decade now, that the brain is finished developed. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Jasmine, I'm going to mute you. Okay. If that worked. I think so. Okay, cool. So the brain finishes development between the ages of 24 to 26. Why is this important? Because the front of our brain controls our impulsivity. It helps us do some long-term planning. When we're teenagers, we literally cannot think far enough ahead to understand that our consequences in the moment are going to have long-term consequences. And it also helps us emotionally regulate. And since we've all been teenagers, I think we can all say that those things are true. And funny enough, aging out of violence starts in the mid to late 20s and continues from there. So why is this important? Well, life without parole is one reason why this is important, Because in order to address the issue of mass incarceration, we have to address life sentences. As of right now, 1 in 7 people who are incarcerated are serving a life sentence, whether it's under life without parole or a virtual life sentence, as in they're serving, 50 years, 60 years, and they won't be released, before they pass away. What's noteworthy is that this is, again, a thing that the United States is unique in. There are other countries who use it, but noteworthy, it has been banned by the United Nations and identified as inhumane. And the court case that actually that was a result of that was actually 3 individuals who had committed particularly sadistic and heinous murders, what many Americans would say deserve the death penalty, actually. And they were given opportunities to be rehabilitated and return to society. The International Tribunal, which prosecutes war crimes, that means genocide. So people who are found guilty of genocide receive a maximum of 25 years, and then their case is reviewed for possible release. Life without parole is ineffective, it's unnecessary for public safety, and in the state of Massachusetts, it costs approximately $55,000 per person per year. So somebody who goes in at the age of 20 and then passes away at the age of 75, that will cost us over $3 million to keep them incarcerated. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to my friend, Jasmine. Take it away.
Hi again. My name is Jasmine Borges. First off, I'd like to say thank you all for joining me and Brashani in this conversation on such an important topic about mass incarceration and systemic racism. I am a formerly incarcerated woman, and tonight I'd like to share a piece of my story in hopes that it may spark some thoughtful type of conversation, reflection, and I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi is a little crazy right now. Reflection and understanding between us. So I come from chaos and dysfunction. I come from Spanish music, Spanish food, and Spanish parties. I come from silence. Silence that kept my family secrets of drugs and addiction and domestic violence. Silence that kept to keep my family together, even when my father beat my mother in drunken rages. Silence that kept when he went to prison repeatedly. Silence that kept when he lost himself to his own addiction. Silence that kept when I grew older and found myself a teen parent, drug dealer, and in a vicious cycle of domestic violence. Silence was key because in my neighborhood, the police were never the good guys. I come from a place in this country where every man I knew in my young life at some point in time was incarcerated. Mass incarceration is generational in my family. And this place that I come from is not unique to only my family. It is a place of systemic racism, systemic classism. It is a place where the American dream is non-existent. Mass incarceration has decimated 2.2 million families in America, and predominantly Black and brown families. That's 2.2 million families without mothers, fathers, daughters, sisters, sons, wives, husbands. Women make up the largest population of those incarcerated. We represent 1.2 million out of the 2.2 million. And out of the 1.2 million women incarcerated, 80% are mothers. When I was sentenced at 21 years old to a 10 to 15-year sentence, my daughters, who you guys can see on the screen, those are my babies, Dynasty and Liberty were 5 years old and 11 months old. 12 years later, when I came home to a 17-year-old and a 13-year-old. Times that I'll never get back. From the moment of arrest, the dehumanization and the degradation begins. I was stripped of my God-given family name and given a number. My body was now state property, and I was subjected to countless demeaning and demoralizing strip searches and pat searches. Understand, the prison system is built to break the human mind and the human spirit. It re-traumatizes those of us with past traumas on a daily basis. We are told when to sleep, when to wake, when to interact with our loved ones, what we can eat, what we can wear, and privacy does not exist. I cannot tell you how many times a male staff has seen at least one piece of my body. There's endless cruelty and name calling, body shaming, and sexual advances not welcomed. I saw my sisters beaten by officers. I saw my sisters die from drug overdoses in prison. I saw my sisters take their own lives because, as I said, the prison system is built to break down the human mind and the human spirit. When I went to prison for a long time, nothing changed for me. And it took me an even longer time to heal from the chaos and dysfunction that I come from. So I say this repeatedly. Prisons do not work. Prisons did not change me. And if they did work, the recidivism rate within this country, within the state of Massachusetts, would be a lot lower, but they're not. Prisons would be empty. Officers would not have jobs. Like, people would be rehabilitated, but prisons are not a place of rehabilitation. It is punitive. Simple. That's simple. So for me, what happened for me was I found my redemption in forgiveness, healing, education, and my daughters, and then the decision to finally change something and start breaking generational cycles within my family. I am the first person in my family to graduate high school in 4 generations. I am the first person to graduate college in 4 generations within my family. Breaking cycles, my oldest daughter, graduated high school last year. So again, um, coming out, after 12 years has been challenging. Uh, there's a severe lack of reentry services, and to help women and men like me to acclimate into society. Because of the branding label, we say felon. There are certain jobs, careers I may never ever have. Finding housing and furthering my education has proven extremely difficult. Thankfully, there have been caring and loving individuals that have helped me on my journey and continue to help me. You know, the Bethany House of Hope, Sister Regal, Jolie Bayron, Karen Masterson's, um, friends like me who have come, who have endured prison and survived prison and have thrived after prison have helped me. My family has helped me. They helped me find an apartment. They helped me find a job with owners that believe in second chances and redemption. Um, they've helped me navigate family dynamics. They've helped me learn how to become a mom again. They've helped me how to drive again, just navigate a smartphone and just let me know that I'm not alone and that I'm not other. But this love and support that I've received is unique to me. This does not happen for every brother and sister that comes home. Most brothers and sisters that come home are met with homelessness, unemployment, unable to pay court fees, parole fees, probation fees, which leaves them to be violated and go back into prison, continuing the revolving doors of mass incarceration. Finally, I want to end by saying that 96% of us who are incarcerated and leave, we come home and we come into your communities, even those who have committed violent offenses. You know, We come into your communities, we ride the bus with you, we ride the train with you, we go to the same grocery stores as you. So understand one thing, if you don't take anything else from my story, is that my brothers and sisters are not irreparable. We are redeemable, we do change, and we do deserve second chances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. So powerful. Thank you. So I did promise you move into a Q&A session. Before I stop sharing my screen so I can actually see all the chats that are popping up and whatnot, I just want you guys to know that you can get a hold of Jasmine and I at the email address that you got the Zoom confirmation from. So it's iamink@gmail.com. And I have a list of resources for people that I'm going to send out after just some introductory resources to sort of get you started if you want to learn more about what we talked about tonight. And I also have my references too. So if people are interested in that, I'll share that information over email as well.